copying artwork into InDesign. And the big exception is copying Illustrator artwork. When you copy art from Illustrator and paste it into InDesign, you get editable vector shapes that you can actually change in your InDesign layout. For example, I'll go to the next spread here, Option page down to go to the next spread, and then I'll zoom in just on this portion of the page. And I want to put a big Javaco logo on this page. So I'm going to go to Bridge, and I'll go to Bridge by clicking on the Bridge icon in the control panel. I'll select the image that I want to bring in, but instead of actually bringing the image in as an Adobe Illustrator file, I'm going to double-click on that image, which opens it in Illustrator. If I select it in Illustrator, you can see this is actually the vector points. Those are the points on the vector Bezier path, and I can copy that, Command-C or Control-C on Windows, and go back to InDesign and paste. When I paste, it looks like the original image, but the difference is you actually have editable paths. For example, with the Direct Selection tool, I can move those points around and move the control handles. Even more cool, you can copy InDesign objects into Illustrator too. It goes both ways. That way you can apply all kinds of wacky Illustrator effects to InDesign objects. That's really more of an advanced topic though, and we're going to cover that in a future title. But this ability to move vectors back and forth between InDesign and Illustrator is very, very powerful. Note that you shouldn't copy and paste all your Illustrator artwork into InDesign. In general, using Place to import an Illustrator file, like a PDF or an AI file, is much more reliable and efficient. You know, text and complex artwork often doesn't paste into InDesign very well. You can get very unexpected results. In general, reserve the copy and paste feature for when you have relatively simple artwork, like a logo, and when you really need to make changes to the vector objects in InDesign. You've seen me selecting objects on pages throughout all the earlier movies. Let's take a moment to really look at the details of selecting objects, because there are some subtle and sometimes confusing aspects to this seemingly simple task. The basic tools involved with selecting objects are the Selection tool, the black arrow, and the Direct Selection tool, the white arrow in the tool panel. Let's look at the black arrow, the Selection tool first. The Selection tool lets me select an entire object, including everything inside it. So for example, I can click on this text frame and move it and the text as well. Or I can click on this image frame, this graphic frame, and move that and the picture inside of it. If you're familiar with Quark Express, it's basically the same as that program's Item tool. Now the Direct Selection tool, which I can click on here or just press the keyboard shortcut A, gives me something different. It lets me select a portion of an object or select inside an object. For example, with this picture frame, I can actually select a point right on the edge there and move it. You see? I've actually moved that point. Or I can drag a segment on the frame simply by dragging it. Or if I click inside the frame, I've selected the picture inside the frame. It's a separate object inside the frame. The picture can move separately from the frame itself. Similarly, the frame can move separately from the picture itself. If I click on the edge of the frame, I'm telling InDesign to select the frame. And now, if I move the center point turns out to be very, very useful. If I move the center point here, it's as though I'm moving all the points on that frame simultaneously. InDesign CS3 has a little nifty shortcut. If you double-click with one of the selection tools, it selects other selection tool. So for example, if I double-click on this picture, it switches back to the selection tool. And then I can move the entire frame. If I want to move the picture inside of there, I'll simply double-click on it, and it switches to the Direct Select tool, and then I can move the picture inside the frame. It's a handy little shortcut. If I double-click on top of a text frame, I get a different effect. Double-clicking on a text frame with either the Selection or the Direct Selection tool will actually change to the Type tool. Now I can select the text inside the text frame or edit it or whatever I want to do with it. Now you probably know that whenever you're editing text, you can press Command-A or Control-A on Windows to select all of the text inside that text frame. Well, the same thing goes with the selection tools. If I have the selection tool, I can press Command-A or Control-A on Windows to select all the objects on the spread. It doesn't select all the objects in the entire document, only on this one spread. Now let's say I want to deselect everything. You can deselect everything by pressing Command-Shift-A or Control-Shift-A on Windows. That's a really good one to keep in mind. That's very helpful. Deselect everything on the page. Of course, another way to deselect everything is simply by clicking on someplace on the page that doesn't have any object, though. Again, if I select all with Command-A or Control-A on Windows, I can click out here where there's no object, and that will also deselect everything on the page. I'm going to zoom in here using my keyboard shortcut, the Command spacebar or Control spacebar on Windows. I'm going to try and select this picture. If I click on that picture, it doesn't select. Why? Because this big text frame is on top of it. So how do I select through that text frame to the picture beneath? Command click or Control click on Windows selects through an object. In fact, if you have a number of objects stacked on top of each other, like this picture over here, I can actually select through each one of those one at a time. Click to get the top one, Command click to go through that to that frame beneath it, click again to go through the next frame, click again to go to that back frame, click again, and it moves to the top, and I get an object. I know it's a grouped object, a bunch of grouped objects, because I see a dashed line. And we're going to be talking about groups of objects and how to group objects together in a later chapter. But for now, I do want to point out how you can select inside of a group if you have a group of objects. One way to select inside of a group is to use the direct selection tool. So, for example, I'll double-click on this picture, and it switches to the direct selection tool, and it selects one of those objects. Now, with the direct selection tool, I can click on any one of those. For example, that line, or that frame in the background, or this frame, or the picture inside of it. The direct selection tool lets me select any object inside of a group. If I then want to move one of those objects inside the group, no big deal. Select the object I want to move, let's say that frame, and then use the center point again. Again, that center point, very, very handy for moving one object inside of a group of objects as well. And going back to selecting the object within a group, I want to point out these buttons up in the control panel. There's 4 buttons here which are really handy. The select container, select content, and then select next and previous. So what is that all about? Well, every group is a container for other objects, right? So if I select this whole group, I'll use the selection tool to select the entire group. You'll see that the select container is grayed out because the group itself is the container. But I can click on the select content, and that will select the first item in the group. Now I can move through the items in that group by using the select next button. That selects this group over here. This is actually a group that contains another group. So I can select inside that group, and then select the next item in that. So you can see you can move through the objects on your page or inside of a group very fluidly, very easily, just by clicking those buttons. To move back up the stack, I can say select the container, which is that entire group, and select the container again, and I'm back to where I was. I've selected the entire group that's holding all of those objects. Now that you've got the hang of selecting objects in your documents, let's explore how to format those objects, starting with how to assign a fill or a stroke color. Need to set the color of an object? Well, do you want to color its background fill or its stroke, what some people call the border? InDesign, just like Illustrator, lets you apply a fill or stroke color to any object on your page. In text, the trick is managing the fill and stroke icons. Those icons show up in 3 different places. Down here at the bottom of the tool panel, you see the fill icon and the stroke icon. Whichever one you click on comes to the top, and that's the one you're going to control. Same thing shows up here in the swatches panel. In the swatches panel, there's the fill icon and the stroke icon. Whichever one you click on comes to the top. That's what you'll control. You also see those in the color panel. A little bit bigger here, easier to click on, but they do exactly the same thing, no matter where you click on them. I'm going to focus on the swatches panel. I'll talk about the colors panel in a later chapter. By the way, a little shortcut. As long as you're not editing text, you can press the X key, and the X key swaps whichever one's on top, just like Illustrator. Here, the fill icon is on top, hit X, and now the stroke icon's on top. Let me zoom in here on this part of the page, and we'll do some editing. First, let's start with text. I'll double-click on this text frame to switch the type tool, and I'll select this word, this little phrase here, and I can see that it's currently filled with this color. If I want to change the color of the font, no problem. Simply click on a different color in the swatches panel, and you'll see that it changed. Well, actually, you don't see that it's changed because it's highlighted. So why don't I click off of it, and now you can see that it's changed. I'll select it again, and we'll do something different. This time, we're going to stroke the text. We'll stroke it with, let's say, magenta. Why not? That'll be very strange looking. And now we can see that this text is both filled and stroked. I didn't need to convert it to outlines or anything like that. It's still the editable text, but it has a fill and a stroke. Now how about colorizing objects? I'll hit the escape key, which switches to the selection tool automatically, and now I'll select on this object over here. I see these dotted lines. That means that this is a group of 2 different objects, so I'll double-click to select that one object, and now I'm going to fill this with a different color. Hit X to move the fill to the top, and then I can simply click on a swatch to change its color. Simple as that. If I want to give it a stroke, click on the stroke icon and give it a color. Let's say I give this a more strong fill. How about a bright red color? I'll go down to the bottom here and fill this with a bright red. Oh, that's a little bit too bright. So how about we make it a tint of that bright red? So I can change the tint number here. I'll simply select that number and change it, let's say, to 60%, hit enter, and now I've got a 60% tint of that. I also have this little button here which brings up a slider, and then I can move the slider back and forth, get just the look I'm looking for. Here's a little shortcut for the swatches panel. I don't actually have to select an object in order to colorize it. For example, I can simply select this red color, I simply drag it out of the swatches panel and on top of the object that I want to apply it to. Note that I didn't actually select this object, but it still got that fill color. I can do that with strokes too. For example, I can take this green stroke and I'll put it on top of this background object here. Look at the cursor. Here, the cursor has a little line next to it. That means it's going to apply the color to the stroke. If I pull out a different color and apply it here, you see the cursor changes. This means it's going to apply the color to the fill. Sometimes I change the fill and stroke so much that I don't know what I want anymore, and I just want to go back to the default, just no fill and a simple one-point black stroke. How can you do that? Just hit the D key. D applies the default colors. One-point black stroke and no fill. Let's go up to the control panel and you'll see this value up here. This is the stroke width value. So I can choose a heavier stroke. Let's make a big 7-point stroke, why not? And you can adjust this to anything you want. Of course, you can always select that and type in exactly what you want. If you want 6.5 points or something like that, you can do an exact value. Now the pop-up menu underneath it is the stroke style, the type of stroke you want. And by default, it's set to solid. But you can change it to a double stroke, or you could set it to triple or dashes or dotted. There's also all kinds of other wacky things they put in here, like these left slant hash and right slant hash. There's also dotted and Japanese dots. I'm not sure what makes these any more Japanese than the other dots, but they're a little bit more close together. Here we've got dots that are closer together than the other regular dotted style. There's much more that you can do with fills and strokes, including really fine-tuning your strokes in all kinds of ways, and that's what we're going to cover in the next movie. Do you want to fine-tune your strokes? No problem. While the control panel lets you adjust the width and the style of your stroke, the ultimate in stroke control, you need the stroke panel. Let's click on here so we can see the stroke panel, and there's all kinds of controls. I'm just going to go over a few of them. Let's zoom in here just so we can see that shape here. This is a fun one to work with. And now I'm going to click on that. It's a group of objects, and I'll hit D to set it to the default styling of no fill and a black stroke. Let's make these strokes a little bit thicker, maybe 6 points, so we can really see, whoa, that's a little bit too much. I'm going to make that smaller by clicking in the field here, and I'll use the down arrow. Remember, the arrow keys will let you adjust any numeric field in InDesign, so I'll hit the down arrow key to go down to 3-point stroke. Sure, that looks a little bit better here. And then we can change the type, just like we could up in the control panel. Let's change it to, let's say, thin. That gives us something to work with. Whenever you're working with a stroke style that has an area between lines, or between dashes, or between dots, that's the gap. And the gap can be colored as well. You change that, of course, with the gap color pop-up menu. Let's choose some color, maybe bright yellow here. Now we can see that there's a yellow in the gap and black in the stroke itself. Next thing I want to point out is the align stroke feature. By default, it's set to align on the center of the path. Right? When you draw a path, for example, I'll grab the line tool. If I draw a line and switch to the direct select tool, and you'll see, especially if I make this really thick, you'll see that the stroke is actually centered on the path itself. Well, the same thing's going on here. The stroke is centered along the path, but I can change that by switching to the line inside the path or a line outside the path, and you can see you get very different effects depending on which of those you choose. The stroke panel also lets you adjust the start and end points of a path. For example, let's go ahead and choose this path that I just drew here. This will be the easiest to see, and I'll put an end cap on it. How about a curved arrowhead? There we go. That's how you get an arrowhead on a line. I can do the same thing at the starting point. This point over here is where I started drawing it, so that's the starting point of that path, and I'll put on, let's say, a solid square there. There we go. So we've got kind of an interesting looking effect. Might not need to use that for every job, but when you need it, it's good to know that all these features in the stroke panel are there.